Prologue. The whispering breeze was the only sound. It was a cold, blistering winter day. The kind of cold that makes your bones hurt. Everything was covered with snow. The boughs of the fir trees were white, and the drifts butted up against the base of each trunk. Besides the ever-so-often wind gust, no sound could be heard. The almost 7,000 feet of altitude made the air thin and crisp. The cabin sat on the edge of a small bowl at the base of several rocky snow-covered peaks. The almost 4 feet of snow made the trees surrounding the cabin look short. Their dark bark and green boughs are barely visible under the masking of snow. It was deathly quiet as the image of the distant cabin came into focus in the riflescope's glass-filled tube. "Still no movement." "Over," Jim Cato said in a half-whisper into the bone-conducting microphone wrapped around his right ear. "Roger, he should be there. I don't think the source gave us bad intel." "Good copy. I'm not complaining, boss, just keeping you informed." 6 months of intense training by the CIA had taught Jim to suffer with pride. No matter the situation, rain, sleet, snow, swamp, cold, or heat, it was much easier for Jim to acclimate to the heat than the cold. Jim's home state of Mississippi was known for its heat waves, but not so much for its cold fronts and blizzards. The training for Jim's position at the CIA Special Activities Division had been rigorous. In the short 6 months to cover all of the potential climate changes Jim might encounter, his training had taken him worldwide and from the bottom to the top of the globe. The division had expanded on Jim's training and knowledge as a reconnaissance expert, placing a bolt-action rifle in his hands. Coupled with precision rifle training, Jim had become a sneaky force to be reckoned with. Jim was 2 months out from his CIA training and on his second operation. The cabin was mainly built from logs cut and hewn from the surrounding forest. It was not a large structure, but contained 3 separate rooms, a living room and a kitchen area, a bathroom, and 1 decent-sized bedroom. Smoke billowed out of the metal stack, protruding through the snow that had amassed on the roof. 2 guy wires were barely visible as they ran from near the top of the smokestack and disappeared into the snow. A thin-covered front porch was home to 2 wooden chairs, 1 on each side of the front door. A large stack of withered firewood was on the left side of the cabin, nestled next to the outer wall. The cold, still day's solitude was broken by snow crunching under a footstep several yards behind where Jim lay camouflaged in the snowbank. As the sounds approached Jim's position, the single crunch sound turned into multiples. Jim slowly reached with his right hand a few inches over to where he had placed his Glock 19 pistol for easy access under a white snow camouflage cloth. His hand was firmly wrapped around the grip as the sounds were now all around his position. The first subject slowly walked a few feet past Jim and knelt in the snow. The other sounds stopped as the subject lay a submachine gun across his lap wrapped in white tape, and the person lifted a pair of binoculars to his face, looking in the direction of the cabin. Jim's heart rate increased as adrenaline began to circulate in his body. This caused Jim to breathe faster, which he attempted to subdue, given the cold air and the increased white clouds of exhaled breaths that somebody might detect. Jim held his breath in an attempt to settle his heart rate and not give his position away. Then, underneath the white cloth, Jim slowly moved the position of the Glock to where the muzzle was pointed in the general direction of the subject kneeling in the snow several yards ahead of him. Without words, the subject stood up and crept down the slope toward the edge of the bowl where the cabin was set. The crunching sounds that had subsided behind him picked up again as 4 more subjects crept past Jim's position. The 5 subjects were all wearing snow camouflage tunics and pants, each holding a white taped-wrapped submachine gun at the low ready as they stalked behind the leader. The 5 subjects moved slowly and methodically in the direction of the cabin. "Hey, boss, we've got company. 5 armed subjects approaching the cabin from the front." "Aren't you in the front?" Don responded. "They just moved past me. Looks like we aren't the only ones that want this guy." "We're still 20 minutes out, over." "I don't think we have 20 minutes, boss. We're moving as fast as we can in the snow. Do what you gotta do." Victor Romanoff spooned up a taste of still-cooking soup to check for spice. The soup had been cooking on top of the potbelly stove that Victor had been feeding wood all afternoon. It was almost perfect. "A little more salt in about 5 more minutes," he thought. The crackling fire in the potbelly stove was interrupted by the distant bark of a squirrel somewhere outside the cabin. Victor paused, cocked his head to the side, and glanced at the small wooden dinner table in the center of the room. The Tokarev pistol his father had given him lay on the far side. Victor had heard the squirrels bark the days before, but this time it felt different. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He felt this time it might be a predator coming at him. Victor crept slowly across the wooden floor. He picked up the pistol from the table, eased the slide partially back, and saw that the chamber concealed a live round. A few minutes later, the door to the cabin burst open. The cold, thin air quickly filled the small structure. The prominent figure standing in the doorway moved slowly over the threshold while looking down the sights of an H&K UMP submachine gun. The armed men had methodically camouflaged their guns with white tape to match their winter surroundings. Behind the prominent figure were 4 others. They were stacked up at the door, ready to make entry. Military or operators of some sort, Jim thought. Jim had watched the armed subjects move to the cabin using military-style tactics. Jim had only been 100% sure of the armed men's intentions once he observed them stack up near the door. Jim settled the crosshairs of his rifle dead center on the back of the second subject in the stack. When he pulled the trigger, a million things were going through Jim's mind. It only took the 250-grain .338 Lapua round a fraction of a second to travel the distance between Jim and the cabin. The armed men had not been expecting resistance from outside the place. The subject crumpled to the wooden deck of the porch. Jim quickly cycled the rifle's bolt to feed a live round into the chamber. Hearing the loud boom and seeing the man behind him fall to the floor, the armed subject, who had been first through the door, bolted into the cabin to where the wooden table sat in the middle of the living room. The cracked boom of Jim's initial shot rang out through the silence. The remaining 3 armed men on the porch turned toward the direction they heard the gunshot ring out just as Jim sent a second bullet to the front porch. The 2 remaining armed men disappeared from Jim's view. Victor had hidden behind a large chifforobe near one of the walls of the living room. He heard the floorboards creaking as the armed subject moved around the living room and kitchen area. The man was hunting Victor. Victor's hand was shaking as he quietly reached with his right thumb up to the single-action hammer of the pistol and eased it back to cock the weapon. As quiet as he could be, there was no way around the hammer's metallic click as it locked back in battery. The creaking movement Victor had heard in the cabin suddenly stopped. "Come out of hiding, my friend," came the voice of the armed subject, speaking in broken Slavic. Victor did not move a muscle. Instead, he closed his eyes and squeezed them tight. Victor knew his actions might have caught up to him. The armed subject moved slowly across the living room with his UMP machine gun trained on the chifforobe from which he had just heard the metallic click. The 250-grain bullet struck the man in the lower thigh. The bullet almost severed the leg near the knee as he fell to the wooden floor. Jim had been able to thread a shot through the doorway's opening when he had seen the lower half of the armed man pass the open space. Victor heard the man yell in pain at the same time he crumpled to the floor, and a third gunshot from outside the cabin somewhere. He leaned out from behind the chifforobe, pistol in hand, and pointing it at the subject, writhing on the floor near his dinner table. Victor could now see the face of one of the men sent to kill him. He was clearly from an Eastern Bloc country. The man lifted his gloved hands in a manner of giving up, but it was only a ruse. The subject reached for the UMP machine gun, and Victor squeezed the trigger on the Tokarev pistol. The bullet hit the floor near the head of the man, causing him to flinch and realize Victor had missed. Victor squeezed the trigger a second time, just as the man lifted the machine gun, hitting him just below his throat. The man pulled the trigger on the UMP out of reaction and sent bullets spraying into the log rafters of the cabin. The snow was deep. Even with snowshoes, Don and Griever were still sinking. The heavy packs and weapons they carried did not help the weight displacement. Griever was a few yards ahead of Don as he trudged up the mountain toward Jim and the cabin. Griever was breathing heavily, with large plumes of white breath puffing from his mouth and nose. He froze in mid-stride. The sound of the .338 Lapua going off echoed through the mountains of the Bavarian Alps. Neither Don nor Griever spoke a word. They knew Jim had taken matters into his own hands based on their last communication. "Talk to me, Jim. What's going on up there?" Don said between panting breaths. "Little busy right now, boss," came the quick reply from Jim. We're still A few 100 yards out and downhill of you, over." No reply from Jim gave Don and Griever the answer. They knew Jim could only hold on so long with a bolt-action rifle and a Glock pistol. Their lungs were on fire as they sped up to a near run up the side of the mountain. Jim knew he needed to displace. After 3 shots, the remaining armed men must have honed in on his position. Jim stood up out of the snowbank that had concealed him. He shook off the snow from his back and shoulders, gathered his few pieces of gear, and ran to the left, deeper into the timber and out of the wide open. The fir and maple trees were dense on the German mountainside. The taller trees swayed back and forth, creaking with the light breeze. Jim moved slowly, slightly hunched over, trying to make a smaller profile, his rifle slung on his back crossways, resting atop his pack. The Glock pistol was firm in his hands, held slightly out in front of himself as he moved toward the cabin. The multiple rounds from the UMP 9mm machine guns missed Jim by a few feet as they splashed snow around him. Several rounds hit the maple trees, sending splinters of bark across the white snow. Jim dove to the base of a nearby maple, where the snow had lumped up to form a mound. He fired the Glock 19 down the mountain slope at a human form he could see standing, nudged up next to the tree of a fir tree. Jim shifted his fire and began tracking another person running upslope to his left. It was apparent the men were trying to get an angle on him. The Glock's slide locked back. Jim ripped the spent 15-round magazine from the base of the grip, pulled a fresh magazine from its pouch on the side of his combat belt, seated the magazine, released the slide, and looked for work. Snow was kicking up all around his position as Jim was fired on from 2 angles. He could hear the men yelling back and forth to each other in an unrecognized foreign language. At the same time, his earpiece squawked. "Jim, we're close. Over. Copy, boss. I'm pinned. Oh!" "Jim. Jim? You copy?" The 9mm round found its way through the snowbank and into the top of Jim's left shoulder. The bullet traveled a few inches down his left scapula before exiting. The shock wave carried by the projectile temporarily paralyzed Jim's left arm. He slid a few feet down the snowbank into the open. The armed man, downslope from Jim, advanced up the mountain. He saw Jim was hit and took advantage of the situation. The man changed the magazine of the machine gun while moving toward Jim, never taking his eyes off him. There was no pain, but Jim could not feel his left arm. He realized he had dropped the Glock when it hit, and it lay in the snow several feet up the mountain. Jim looked to his right, down the mountain slope, and saw the man in snow camouflage approaching fast and raising the UMP to fire at him again. The Tokhorov's bullet found its mark for the second time this day. Victor fired 3 more rounds at the man, advancing toward Jim until he was lying lifeless on the side of the mountain. Jim motioned with his hand for the man who had just saved his life to stay where he was. Unfortunately, 1 more armed man was still on the mountain, trying to kill them. Victor acknowledged the universal language of hand symbols and hid behind a large boulder. Victor pulled the magazine from the pistol. Only 2 rounds were left, 1 in the magazine and 1 in the chamber.